Hi, this is Fr Roth, and this is another part of my Science and Religious series, where I kind of go over parts where science and religion overlap, and today I'm starting a multi-part proof for God. When I talk about proofs, I think there's two ways people ever hear them. It's in math classes, where you talk about mathematical proofs, and these can be very concrete. It's you take one equation, you add something on both sides, you rearrange it, and you have a proof for a new equation that has to be true. And then there's the philosophical proofs. These you have a series of premises, and if all premises are true, you have to accept the conclusion. For example, if you say, only mammals have hair, I have hair, therefore I'm a mammal, right? You can discuss both of the premises, both of those first 2 points, but if they're true, you have to accept the conclusion. It's the philosophical proof that I'm going to be looking at for this proof for God. This is important to point out because philosophical proofs seem to be more open, obviously, to discussion, to kind of observing and really kind of looking at the different points I'll be making, and feel free to really question them and look at them yourself. But today, this part, my proof is going to be about showing that time can't be infinite. I'm going to start with a really old paradox, actually, Zeno's paradox. This goes back to the ancient Greeks. And what Zeno did is he looked at kind of infinities, and he showed the error in them, or how they can't be in the real world, through the example of Achilles chasing after a tortoise. But to simplify the paradox a little bit, I'm going to use a different form of it, and it's a man trying to get across a room and leave the room. So he's on one side of the room, and he needs to go through a door on the opposite side. We can define motion in many ways, but in one way, you can define it as just a person walking at, let's say, 1 meter per second, which is quick, but he goes 1 meter per second across the room, then he leaves. Well, Zeno pointed out there's another way we could define motion. He said, well, that person starts on one side of the room, and then he travels half the distance to the door. So now he's in the middle of the room. And now, between the middle of the room and the door, there's another half distance. So he travels that half distance. And now he's only a quarter of the room away from the door, but he's going to travel another half distance, and another half distance, another half distance, so on and so forth, and he'll never make it to the door. Between him and the door, there will always be another half distance he can travel. Zeno used this to show that mathematical infinities can't exist in our world. Because even if those two people were looking like they're moving at the same speed, with this new definition or different definition of movement, we never get to the point where he gets to a point where there's no longer a half distance between him and the door. Relating this to time, let's say you go to work and you have an 8-hour shift and you don't get any breaks. Well, you could say, well, I work an hour at a time, and after 8 of those hour steps, I get to go home. Or you could say, I get to work, and then between work and my time to go home, I work half the time. So you've worked 4 hours. And then you work another half step to the time you go home, and you've worked 2 hours. So now you've worked a total of 6 hours. Then another half step. You've worked 7 hours, another half step, you work 7.5, and so forth. You keep taking the half step, and here you never get to go home. See, this kind of Zeno's paradox works with time as well. For this, we can also extend this. We can make it, instead of just looking at smaller and smaller time scales, we start going to bigger time scales. So instead of picking something that's close to us and making small little steps, let's take something infinitely far away from us, infinitely behind us in time, and take larger steps towards it. What you notice is each time you take a step back, so let's say we pick a point infinitely behind us in time, and we go back 1,000 years. We say, okay, how far is that infinite point from where we are now? It's still an infinite distance. Well, we go back another 1,000 years. It's still an infinite distance. No matter what, no matter how many times we keep going backwards, that infinitely distant point in time will always be infinitely far away from us. Which means we could never go from this point in time back to that point. If we can't get back to it in time, it couldn't traverse forward to us. The problem is, if we're here, there would have to have been some way to go to that infinitely past time to us. Because again, there's real issues that come forward when you bring mathematical infinities into our world. So for this, there would have to be some point, even if it's really, really far back, that seems almost infinite, there'd have to be some beginning point to time. There are some counters to this argument that could be made, and I'd like to address those. The first is a lot of times when you hear Zeno's paradox or this kind of you can't go back infinitely in time, they'll talk about how in math and in sciences there's different types of infinity. And really we'll look at just simply real and artificial infinities. When I'm talking about real and artificial infinities, think of like as an example of artificial infinity is an ant on a football field. When you look at that ant and you study its motion, you can treat it as a point on an infinite plane, or maybe you say that ant in the middle of a continent. You could still treat it as a point on an infinite plane and just study its motion. Really, it's not on an infinite plane. If that ant could live long enough and walk far enough, it would get to the edge of the continent. It would get to the edge of the football field. That's not the situation we have for time. Here, if there's always something before, if there's always something we can go back to continually, that does mean a real infinity. It's an ant on an infinite plane that no matter how far it walks, there's always still an infinite distance for it to traverse. That's us with the time if there was no beginning to time. There's always something before we're talking about. Another objection could be, well, as the Big Bang as we go back towards the Big Bang, time starts acting odd because A, it's a completely different reference frame. Talking about kind of looking at it in a relativistic manner, time would maybe work out differently. Or you could look at it maybe even quantumly because everything's getting so close together. Some kind of odd quantum time takes over. Problem here is, first for the relativity, even if it works differently than how it is now, when you go back to that time and you're in that time, time would still be seeming to operate normally. This is the example of Einstein's two people, one person on the train, the other one on the platform. The person on the platform experiences time normally, and the person on the train experiences time normally. But when they observe the other person, they say that person is having an odd experience of time. That would happen to us. Sure, maybe time might look normal here, but then when we look to the past, we'd say they have an odd amount of odd time. But then when we went back to that time and we're at that point, we would say the time is operating normally, and their time and our time in the future, our now, is operating odd. Or with quantum mechanics, it doesn't matter how time changes or how weird it operates, maybe in a quantum mechanical frame when everything's really close together, there's still a before and an after in the moments, right? Even if it's fluctuations of probability, there's still, the probability was this, and then it became this, and then it did this, then it did this, right? There's still passing of moments, even though we might not exactly understand how that is. And as long as you have that before and after, that this moment, then this moment, this moment, you can keep going back and back and back, and sure, time is operating differently, but you still have that. And therefore, if you don't have a beginning, an actual hard beginning of going infinitely back in time, and you fall into that problem that Zeno's paradox is trying to put forward or show us. The last one is the idea of a cyclical universe. This is the idea that maybe everything works in a circle. In this discussion, we don't have an answer for that. If our universe was in a perfect circle, and when you start at one point, you go the whole way around, and you get back to that point, as long as that's some amount of time, no matter how long it is, that works. Because you could pick any point in that loop and say that's the beginning and the end and trace it the whole way around. But as we continue, again, this is only part one, we're going to answer that question, and we'll also look deeper into all these other parts that we've kind of started to scratch the surface on. If you found this interesting, you can give it a like. Just let me know that this is something you're interested in hearing more about. In the comments, if you found maybe issues with what I've said, or maybe you would like some things kind of explained a little bit further, because I know I can sometimes gloss over things, or maybe there's something you'd like me to go deeper into maybe in a future video, please put in the comments. I'll respond to what I can, and maybe you'll give me a different video or a different thing to discuss later on in the future. But either way, thanks for listening, and God bless. Have a great rest of your day.